Video we're going to study chapter 12 of Aristotle's categories as we continue to work through the categories and close in on our completion of this first reading of Aristotle's categories in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Classical Reasoning 1 course. In chapter 12 here, Aristotle is going to continue to discuss a number of issues to wrap up this study and prepare us to move on to the study on interpretation. And in this chapter 12, he discusses four different senses in which the term prior, or four different ways in which one thing is said to be prior to another. So let's read together chapter 12 and understand more clearly how the term prior is used in speech for the sake of our accuracy in reasoning. Let's read together. One thing is said to be prior to another quadruply, or in four different ways. One thing is said to be prior to another in four different ways. First and most principally, according to time, according to which one thing is said to be older and more ancient than the other. For it is said to be older and more ancient because the time is longer. That's the first way in which one thing is said to be prior to another. Prior with regard to time. Second, in the second place, one thing is said to be prior to another because it does not reciprocate according to the consequence of existence. In the second place, one thing is said to be prior to another because it does not reciprocate according to the consequence of existence. Thus, one is prior to two. For two existing, it immediately follows that one is. But one existing, it is not necessary that two should exist. Hence, the consequence of the existence of the remainder does not reciprocate from the existence of one. But a thing of that kind appears to be prior, from which the consequence of existing does not reciprocate. That's the second way in which a thing may be said to be prior to another. An easier way of understanding this, I think, we learn in our classical arithmetic lessons. We learn about the concept of cointroduction. With cointroduction, which is what I think that Aristotle is really referring to here, when we name one thing, we co-introduce something else. In other words, when we speak the number 2, and we define 2 as 2 units, the number 2 introduces necessarily the idea of 1. 2 introduces 1. But 1, because it is prior, does not introduce 2 by itself. Okay? That's the idea here of the second way in which one thing is said to be prior to another. Prior with regard to co-introduction. The phrase that Aristotle uses here, he says, in the second place, one thing is said to be prior to another because it does not reciprocate according to the consequence of existence. The consequence of its existence does not reciprocate. In other words, they don't co-introduce each other. Okay? I think that's clear enough. His example of the numbers 1 and 2 is pretty clear. So let's move on to the third. In the third place, the prior, that which is prior, is predicated according to a certain order, as in sciences and discourses. For in the demonstrative sciences, the prior and posterior subsist in order, since the elements are prior in order to the diagrams, and in grammar, the elements or letters, are prior to the syllables. And in a similar manner in discourses, for the proem is prior in order to the narration. And this refers to different parts of classical speeches, which you'll study in rhetoric. The proem is prior in order to the narration. To put it in simpler modern terms, the introduction is prior to the body of an essay, okay? And the body is prior to the conclusion. Farther still, besides what we have mentioned, the better and the more honorable appear to be prior by nature. For the multitude are accustomed to say that those whom they more honor and love are prior in their esteem. This, however, is nearly the most foreign of all the modes. So many, therefore, nearly are the modes of priority which are adopted. But besides the above mentioned, there also may appear to be another mode of the prior. For of those which reciprocate according to the consequence of existence, that which is in any respect the cause of the existence of the one may be justly said to be prior by nature. And that there are certain things of this kind is manifest, for that man exists, reciprocates according to the consequence of existence with the true sentence respecting him. For if man is, the sentence is true by which we say that man is, and it reciprocates. For if the sentence is true by which we say that man is, then man is. A true sentence, however, is by no means the cause of the existence of a thing, but it appears that a thing is, in a certain respect, the cause that a sentence is true. For in consequence of a thing existing, or not existing, a sentence is said to be true or false. Hence, one thing may be said to be prior to another according to 5 modes. Okay, so at the beginning of the chapter, Aristotle acknowledges what seems to be a common knowledge that there are 4 different ways or modes by which things may be said to be prior to other things. That seems to have been a common understanding, and in this chapter, Aristotle seems to be presenting a new addition to that and concluding that there are actually 5 ways in which a thing may be said to be prior to another. And let's just quickly review them. First, a thing may be said to be prior with regard to time. That's the first. Very simple. This is prior to that because it took place before it. All right? In the second way, one thing is said to be prior to another because it does not reciprocate according to the consequence of existence. He gave us the example of the numbers 1 and 2, and I said this appears to be the same idea that's expressed as co-introduction in our study of classical arithmetic. Then he goes on to say the third, in the third place or third way, the prior is predicated according to a certain order, as in sciences and discourses. For in the demonstrative sciences, the prior and posterior subsist in a certain order, just as the elements are prior in order to the diagrams, and in grammar, letters are prior to syllables. Okay? Prior in a certain kind of, I guess we could say a certain kind of intellectual order, okay, an order of comprehension. Then he says, better and more honorable appear to be prior by nature, and a prior in sort of a sense of prior in terms of rank or superiority by nature. That seems to be the fourth mode he identifies. And then lastly, we can see him moving in a new direction because, as I said, he's getting ready to enter into the study of his book on interpretation, where he teaches us the doctrine of the propositions. or the doctrine of statements that are true and false. And in the last chapter and in this chapter, we see him getting into these topics. In the last chapter, he talked about different kinds of contraries, and one of them was, or he talked about different kinds of opposites, and he talked about affirmation and negation, and he commented on how affirmation and negation have a peculiar relationship to one another, that only one of them can be true. And here he introduces this fifth mode, where he moves from the thing itself to speech, or what is said about a thing. He says that if a man is, then the sentence "the man is" true, and therefore the reality of the thing is prior to the truth of the sentence of that thing. And that's a fifth mode that he introduces. So in this chapter, in chapter 12, Aristotle discusses 5 different ways in which a thing may be said to be prior to something else. And remember, these last 3, 4, 5 lessons in the categories may seem random, but Aristotle's preparing us just as the first chapter, when Aristotle started talking about homonyms, synonyms, and paronyms, they may have seemed random. But then as we got into the study, we saw how that knowledge was helpful and necessary for us to understand the details of the categories. Now these latter chapters in the categories seem a bit random, like he's just pulling topics out of a hat and discussing them in these final chapters. But we have to understand that he's planning on getting into the doctrine of propositions, or connected speech. And here he's providing us with instruction and clarification on a number of topics that we need to understand in order to progress in that doctrine of propositions. Okay, so let's be patient, work through these chapters, trust our teacher, trust Aristotle as a wise master instructor. If he gives us something to study, let's study it and master it, trusting that he knows what's best for us and is leading us to the best possible understanding of the subject of classical reasoning. All right, I hope that's a helpful introduction to chapter 12. Study this chapter on your own, and if you need any help or would like anything else discussed or clarified, please get in touch with me. I'm happy to help. God bless your studies.